meat or vegan? For decades, health experts have been warning us away from red and processed meats like sausage and cold cuts. People who eat the reddest meat are more prone to developing cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, colorectal cancer and other cancers, says Frank Hu, chair of the Department of Nutrition at Harvard School of Public Health, who has tracked the diets of 300,000 people for up to 4 decades. There is remarkable consistency in the evidence. But a recent study in the Journal of Internal Medicine created a huge stir by reporting that the links between meat and health consequences were insignificant, and by issuing a new set of guidelines recommending that people stop trying to cut back on meat. These new guidelines seem to exonerate meat. Does that mean we can now go wild on pastrami? That wouldn't be wise. There are actually 2 ways to characterize these findings. One is based on the researchers' data, and the other is based on the guidelines they issued. Because those 2 things don't align. The researchers' data actually show that eating more red and processed meats increases rates of premature death. But they then issued guidelines that say, go ahead and continue eating these meats anyway. That doesn't make sense. How did the researchers justify such recommendations? The researchers analyzed their data using a method called GRADE, which was designed for use in drug trials. But it's inappropriate when you're reaching conclusions about dietary patterns. Not surprisingly, the GRADE method determined that the link between meat and poor health was weak. But if you score these studies properly, the evidence is extremely strong. The researchers claim that the studies that do link red meat to disease are observational studies. And we don't have enough long-term randomized trials to prove the link. But the idea that you can't learn something from observation is false. Think about telling kids not to run with scissors. We don't have randomized controlled trials of kids running with scissors, do we? We just know from observation that it's dangerous. The report also claims that nutritional guidelines should consider that people like to eat red meat. Does that make sense? Some people like using cocaine, too. If we did a systematic review of randomized cocaine trials using the same criteria, we'd find weak evidence, and we could issue a statement saying, go ahead and do cocaine. But it would be irresponsible. Meat by the numbers. 109 pounds, amount of red meat consumed by the average American each year. An 18% increase in risk of heart disease mortality from 1 serving a day of red meat. A 23% increase in risk of breast cancer for women who eat the reddest meat. But the researchers say that current levels of meat intake aren't necessarily harmful. If I tell you that the risk of death associated with eating red and processed meats is 1 person per 1,000, that might sound like a very small risk. But 1 in 1,000 adds up to 325,000 deaths in the US every year. That's like 2 jumbo jets crashing every day. That would be a real crisis. So what would motivate the researchers to issue these guidelines? It's unclear. But a few years ago, this very same group reached exactly the same conclusion about added sugar. They said, go ahead and keep eating added sugar, because we used a scoring technique that says our data are too weak to say otherwise. It turns out that the group had funding from the International Life Sciences Institute, which receives money from Coca-Cola and PepsiCo. Think industry influence. The current study raises concerns about industry influence as well. The report should have never been published. If I do eat meat, how do beef, pork and lamb rank, health-wise? Is one better than the other? In terms of health, the cut and how the animals were raised are really the most important issues. Lean cuts are better than fatty ones, and the best animals are raised in pastures that give them access to native diets. Pigs should be able to forage, and cattle and sheep like a variety of grasses. If you follow those guidelines, then overall, the meats are fairly similar in terms of their health effects. Is it better to choose turkey bacon and chicken sausage? Or does the processing undo any health advantages? Other ingredients being comparable, you'll get some health benefit by switching from processed red meat to processed poultry. But not much. Are the new meatless meats a better option? Meat alternatives pose less cancer risk than processed meats, like bacon and sausage. But whether an Impossible Burger or a veggie burger is better than lean, pasture-raised meat? For now, that's less certain. The products are highly processed, and processed foods have been implicated in all sorts of health problems, including obesity. I'd say meat alternatives are better for the environmental impact alone, but nothing will beat whole plant foods. So how much meat is safe to eat? The World Health Organization has identified processed meat, like pepperoni or bacon, as a carcinogen. And there's no benefit to eating any amount. With red meat, the advice is no more than 3 servings per week. But replacing meat with vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans and nuts shows reductions in mortality and disease. So somewhere between 0 and 3 servings per week is a good recommendation. Despite these grim warnings, the separation of health and sustainability persists today in much of the medical world. Researchers are often furthering contradictory evidence imposed by the cattle industry and subsequently, by paid lobbyists and the US government. Subscribe to Total Transformation channel.